We thought we'd switch roles, see if you noticed a different British guy doing the talk. And thanks to everyone, and thanks especially to Ian for relinquishing a speaking spot for me. So I'm John, I'm with the National Cancer Institute, as Ian said. And I'm here to talk about the CBIIT program. It's not a commercial for CBIIT. Those of you who've seen us before will be blessedly happy to hear. Actually, I'm here really to get y'all's advice. We're the National Cancer Institute, we're the Cancer.gov, we're the government's principal agency for cancer research and training. We were sort of formed in 1937. We have a hospital, have tons of stuff in Bethesda near Washington, D.C. We were sort of really empowered to be like a bigger agency than the other parts of the National Institutes of Health by the National Cancer Act in 1973, which kind of launched the war on cancer. And those of you who are students of American politics will know that when the government of America launches wars on things, we don't always do terribly. It's a franchise. We had the war on this, the war on that, and this was the first one. And maybe not surprisingly, we haven't actually cured cancer yet. Why are we in the informatics space? That's part of the reason. This is one of our pieces of NCI propaganda, the happy patient surrounded by this web of research and care and so on. All the P's we want to make participatory, preemptive, predictive, and something else medicine that really links research and care in this kind of web and creates a healthcare system rather than a kind of disconnected healthcare kind of sector. So this is all our propaganda. How are we doing in that? Well, because in large part of NCI funding of research that I don't have anything to do with the author of this book or the publisher or anything, but that we at a basic level can get an understanding of how cancer works, but we can't yet and haven't yet really made a dent in these grim figures on the side. Someone dies of cancer about 1 a minute, and about 3 people get diagnosed with cancer every minute, and there's a huge human and, in fact, financial cost of that. It's kind of so we're coming to this based upon the fact that we're not really making a dent in cancer in the United States, and at least part NCI's assertion, if you like, is that it's because the biomedical research really, as Dan has said and as Ian has said, is behind the knowledge economy curve. We don't, if you, the hotel, most of us are staying out down the road, they know how many rooms are empty, how many are being cleaned, who's checking in, who's checking out. They have a knowledge map of what's going on. We don't have that. We don't know whether drugs work, cancer drugs are given off-label and so on. We don't have that knowledge map. In large part because of disconnectedness, because of silos, because of boutique development activities that connect 2 things together, and those pairwise connections don't scale, stuff like that. And that's kind of what the CBIIT program was designed to try and move away from and move towards a more connected infrastructure like you typically see in most other businesses. Cancer research every clinical trial is an artisanal product that's handcrafted from one-of-a-kind components, and that's part of the reason why it costs $1 billion and takes 10 years. There's a inflated industry figure actually, but it's a lot of money and a lot of time to bring a new drug to market that might actually do anything significant. So what we're trying to do with CBIIT is try and change this 20th century paradigm of a linear paradigm of there's no pointers, but you get the idea on the left. That agents and compounds are discovered. They go through preclinical testing and clinical trials, which is that development thing that's what costs all the money, leading the companies hope to FDA approval. It moves into the clinical care, and it started to be used with patients. And we do have some elemental collection of outcomes data when therapies are in the field. We know if there's eventually, if there's a Vioxx or something, that there's something serious wrong with this. We also learn about new uses for compounds, stuff like that. What we don't do, and what we're trying to do, is move that into kind of connect the edges of the paper so that you add some analysis that can feed right back into research. And that's at a high level what we're trying, and what most folks like recombinant, like most of our community, like Ian, are trying to do too. And we think this goes quite well with what some of the analyst type folks are saying, but the private sector need to do that. Pharma 1.0 is the kind of blockbuster drugs where the kind of the model for drug companies that really doesn't seem to work anymore, where you find something, it's a blockbuster and you make all your money off of it. Pharma 2.0 is this kind of narrow, targeted pharmaceuticals kind of thing that most folks are in now. And 3.0 will be this intimate connection with a health outcomes ecosystem that actually stores and records information through electronic health records, through, for instance, this big government investment in EHRs right now, into a pool of data that that a lot of the folks who are here at Posscon are helping to generate through connected devices, smartphones, social media, that kind of stuff. This does mean that nobody's going to own or control this data. No one entity, not the government, no private companies, nobody is going to control this data. And the value is going to come, thank goodness, from developing insightful solutions with this data if we can get the data to people. And furthermore, it means, we hope, a common market for people who want to make apps, make neat things based on this data that will help improve healthcare, will help resolve problems like cancer. And that open defined interfaces, which is what we're really pushing, mean that we can enable this kind of common market. And we do have this core collection of non-viral open source code that's not abandonware, not yet anyway, that can be reused. We also have an architecture, and I'm not an architect, I'm not going to talk about this very much, but we're working with our friends in the standards community in HL7. We have this thing called SAFE, and it means something, and it's basically, it's about actually how do you use data standards in a SOA, how it provides human readable statements so you can see what the API does, machine testable definitions so you know when it works, platform independent specs so you can use the code, and some of these things we've coded, or you can just take the specs and code them yourself and then use these machine testable definitions to figure out if you've got it right. NCI's had this metadata infrastructure for a long time with common data elements and so on. We want to expand that to include some of the things we've learned from working with the semantic web people, stuff like that. And finally, a sort of SOA framework of actual services, and here's our fabulous periodic table of services, some of which we actually developed, so that, for instance, to take a very, there isn't a pointer, but to take a very kind of bland example, organization, it's just a list of, the Mayo Clinic is an organization, healthcare research organizations, and we have folks in the NCI who curate these things, so you know that this Mayo Clinic that's at this street address is really just the back entrance to the same place with a different address, whereas this Mayo Clinic is a very different Mayo Clinic, is in a different town or something. Those kind of things that require every organization to tediously parse out which is the real place, the same with people, the same with agents, the same with diseases, that kind of infrastructure. We have these services that are open, and you can just, well, they're not all made yet, but the ones that are made already, you can just ping them. You don't have to have an account or be an NCI grantee. You can leverage these in the apps you use already and thus get away from this tedious curation business and focus on functionality. To that end, so we have developed a bunch of capabilities, over 70 tools that we want to talk about, not to advertise them, but to talk about how we make a robust open source community around them. So we have some principal open access for the program, meaning that you don't have to have NCI money or be a grantee or be a cancer center to use any of the data, any of the specs. We provide open development, meaning that actually, so development we do fund and do sponsor is on public conference calls. If you have all the time in the world, you can sit and never be away from a CBIIT conference call if you want to. Open source, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but all the code we sponsor, again, is required to be open source. And federation, meaning that we're not building a big database in Washington. You send your stuff to, and we might give it back to you, or we might not. So lawyer talk, obviously you're not going to read this, but just I put the lawyer talk up to say that it's a BSD style license. It's non-viral, meaning you can take the code, incorporate it into proprietary stuff and sell it. We don't care. The mission of the NIH is dissemination, so our goal is not to tie folks in fact, the lawyeries here, to tie folks in knots with licenses. Any stuff that we develop, you can take and you can incorporate and use without any kind of reach through. Okay, so we're at an inflection point, I think, now with the program, which is really, I think, there's three reasons for that. One is that, the scope of what we've been asked to do is increased. We've been asked to get involved in electronic health records, and I understand why, because, this new connected environment requires that healthcare and research be connected. But at some point, we are probably already have increased the scope beyond the natural remit of the National Institutes of Health. people want to contribute, and this is not just in terms of code, in terms of actual resources. We're not the IRS, and that's the only bit of the government that can take money from anybody, believe it or not. So people can't contribute in any form to us. We can't just take the money. People want to contribute, so we have to find an infrastructure that is not limited to the government that can enable those contributions to actually happen. And finally, these are hard times. The appetite for the government, as you probably, especially the NIH, for funding software development is constrained. And if you've been reading the papers, and we have other countries to bomb and other stuff that we're required to do as a government. I'm going to get fired. That means there's limited appetite for funding software development in these space. So it's not going to be an exclusively government-funded activity from here on in. It's just not. What we think we need, therefore, is, and these are kind of some of the CBIIT mantras: community, content, and connectivity. We have a community, but they're used to thinking of themselves as a user community that supplies needs, supplies requirements, and we still need to keep that, but we need to actually be more aggressive about making this into a true open source development community. And it's not that they don't have developers who want to contribute, they do. We're not giving them A, the plumbing, and B, the governance to make that easy. We need to make that happen. And again, there's no answers at the end of this. The answers are going to come from you telling me what to do, I hope, at some point. Content, and capabilities. We need to coordinate. That should be the community, which is writ very large. Again, there's people from other countries, there's commercial organizations, there's non-profits. It's not just academia that wants to contribute. We need to coordinate everybody who wants to develop software for us, which includes, in large part, extensions to stuff we've already done and new stuff. We need to coordinate that, or have someone coordinate it, at least. And we'll get to that in a minute. And we need to also try and support and guide developers and review code a little bit to make sure it is interoperable, to make sure our sort of vision of a connected enterprise really does start to get made. Okay. Other things we've learned, I say, is that, and this is going to sound kind of embittered, but it's not supposed to be. Not everyone who says they need functionality really needs it, especially if the government say we're going to make something. It becomes an academic exercise of, well, if you were going to make something, it should do that. And then we make it, and they say, well, we're not actually going to use it. I just thought if you were going to make it, you should have this in it. And so we hope that an open source community, if there is some daylight between the government and it, can serve as a market where things sink or swim on their own merits, and if they get adopted, they get a life of their own. They do get developed, and if they don't, they kind of just die off naturally. Not everyone who thinks they can code. This is a tricky one, obviously. Maybe an open source community can be a non-judgmental way of sort of separating code that works from code that doesn't, and giving it kind of appropriate, non-judgmental assessments of its value and so on. And finally, something I learned last night from the telecoms guy, what was his name? Who pointed out that making something open source doesn't necessarily make it cheaper. So we're not looking to offload all this work off of the government, and there's certainly some stuff that's going to be too boring for anyone else to do, and they won't want to do it, especially in terms of the plumbing and infrastructure. But maybe it can make it easier for us to scale beyond, again, the natural boundaries of, say, the National Cancer Institute. So the other thing I should say is we've been here already, right? That CA-BIG was started as we're going to have a community, we're going to play drums in the woods, we're going to hold hands, it's going to be great, it's going to be awesome. And this was, CA-BIG's been around since 2004 with the notion of a real community, and it is a real community. But when it comes to development, they go, well, this is, awesome, and we look forward to playing drums in the woods, but when are you going to show us the room full of money that you've got and start funding some development? And I think the answer to that is, more.org, less.gov. It's not that we're abandoning stuff, but I think we need to put the government in its place as a partner rather than a kind of owner of this activity. That's really all I've got, and I want you to tell me how I'm going to do that. And this is where you can find me. That's it. Thanks.